Hey everybody, Cybertao back with you. We're continuing our wind-up of examining how to handle hanging pawns. This is going to be another dynamic example of the d-pawn break. Again, this is a really key feature of having hanging pawns, that eventual d-pawn break that you're pushing towards. So it behooves you to really get a grasp of the dynamics of the d-pawn break, and when it's appropriate, when it's not, and what it does for your pieces. Today's a pretty classic duel. This is Paul Keres against Keres-Taimanov. This is from the USSR finals 1951. Keres was white, c4. It is remarkable that Keres was known for being such an aggressive attacking player, but he had such a universal opening repertoire. When he was quite young, in the 20s and 30s, he was known for playing aggressive gambit chess with 1e4. He was especially known for playing correspondence chess. He developed his tactical skills that way. Then, of course, once he became an all-time great in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, he had a very universal repertoire. E3. This is very trendy nowadays, and this is certainly a part of my repertoire. This is White's attempt to avoid... d4 would just be back into a queen's gambit declined here, and this is the big theory. E3 looks to omit d4 profitably somehow, and it tries to avoid a lot of the queen's gambit decline theory. I quite like this, and you'll sort of see the point as we go along. So, Black plays bishop b7, and the white plays b3. So this is sort of the point. The white bishop's going to go to b2, where it has an unobstructed diagonal, because we haven't played d4 yet. And white's either going to delay this for delay d4 for the right moment, or just never play it and try to play aggressively on the king side at some point, because he has that open diagonal to work with. Notice that d4 would be pretty much an outright mistake here. This would be into a queen's gambit decline where white has prematurely locked in his dark square bishop on c1. This would be at least equality for black. So b3 is the point of this move order, that bishop is going to go to b2, and because we haven't played d4, it has a fairly profitable diagonal to work with. Castle, b2, b6. I personally think this is possibly a little bit too passive for the given position. c5 would be my choice as black. cxd5, I give another note. I don't want to make the video too long with opening theory, but c takes seems right. a3. This is a very useful move, and you see this little a-pawn or h-pawn nudge in a lot of modern openings. Now, white just takes a quick timeout to take the b4 square away from both the black knights. It restricts their activity. b6 and h4. This is a truly modern opening. I'm not sure Keres would have played something so outrageous for those times. But this is the modern theory to this sort of position. White is simply planning to play knight g5, threatening mate on h7, of course. And if black takes on g5, white would take back with the h-pawn. Just put that on the board real quick. Of course, taking on g5 is a huge mistake, but suddenly this rook on h1 is immediately developed, and white has a decisive initiative against the king side. This would be a dream position for white. This is quite interesting, and this is certainly a lot more interesting than the queen's gambit decline slog that white often finds himself in. And this is why a lot of white players are headed towards positions like this instead of going into the big theory. So b6, it's a little bit passive. It's not necessarily bad. d4, that sort of gives up the dance, and it immediately locks his bishop in on b2 where it's just been deployed. I personally wouldn't want to play this way. I would sort of want to at least take on d5 first, and then play d4. This ensures that black is going to be the one with hanging pawns, because it's hard, now that black has played b6, it's virtually impossible for him not to play c5. Once you said A, you really have to say B. And that sort of ensures that this bishop on b2 is going to be re-unleashed at some point. The problem with playing d4 first is that structure is not guaranteed to be reached. This bishop on b2 might just end up staring at granite for the rest of the game. Notice that queen c2 doesn't really work here. c5. And now the queen is just exposed in the c file. It's different than the previous note because of that trade on d5. So this queen on c2 is just going to be exposed and lose time eventually. So d4, not my favorite move order. I think taking on d5 first is a bit more accurate, and then d4. Because then that c5 move is virtually guaranteed for black, and that ensures that this bishop on b2 is going to get back into the game. But d4, 7... take. I would personally prefer c5. A general rule in your games, if you're looking for one for the opens, be the one increasing the tension in the position, and try not to be the one that's relieving the tension with trades. Generally, the side that is forced to relieve the tension is the one most likely to be making some sort of concession. Not always guaranteed, of course, but just a general rule in your own games. Try to be the one increasing the tension instead of relieving the tension. BC, of course, taking on c4 with the bishop would lose time. That's not why white played this position. c5, so now we're headed for the hanging pawn structure. Knight c6. So again, this is where the knight tends to belong in these structures. If the knight went to d7, notice how blunted off its activity is on d7. This is development for the sake of development. It literally doesn't have anywhere to go to because it's locked into this knight with f6. This is sort of Dvoretsky's superfluous knight. They sort of step on one another's toes. Whereas on c6, it can hop to b4 to harass this bishop on d3. It can hop to a5 to target this pawn on c4. This is definitely the correct mode of development. Queen e2. This isn't working in this specific position. Rook e1 is more sound here. Notice that black can't take the pawn on b4. That just loses the queen. And then knight b4, as in the game, doesn't necessarily work as well here. Bishop e2. Notice that bishop e1, you tend to want to play this move to try to keep the bishop on its aggressive diagonal. But in this specific position, after taking on f3, white has to take back with the f-pawn to save his pawn on d4. And this is very, very ugly. This is too much pawn structure damage. The bishop pair doesn't compensate for that. But bishop e2. And then rook b1, not forced, but the rook is quite nice on this b file. This is a very tense position. I think both sides have good chances here. The hanging pawns aren't necessarily a weakness just yet, but white doesn't have an overwhelming kingside pressure just yet either. So both sides have some good chances to do something here. Queen e2 fails for a specific reason. Rook e8, this is a little bit too passive. It's a good idea in some of these positions because it helps discourage d5 by aiming at the queen on e2. But in this specific position, knight b4 immediately is correct. In hanging pawns, the bishop pair is often a huge ally to the hanging pawns because the bishop pair is what gives those hanging pawns a lot of dynamism. They sort of organize themselves behind the hanging pawns and they take advantage of the c or the d pawn break, usually the d pawn break. But that bishop pair aiming at the king side is what gives white's position a lot of danger. If black can eliminate that bishop pair, especially that light squared bishop, it's sort of similar to the isolated pawn, and that light squared bishop is the real troublemaker, the real dangerous piece. If black can eliminate or harass that light squared bishop, it can benefit black quite a bit. Rook a1 is sort of forced. If white tries to preserve that bishop, bishop takes f3. This is well timed. Again, this d pawn is hanging. And if the queen takes to preserve the pawn structure, the queen just takes back. The queen on a2 was defending the bishop on b2, so there's a profitable discovery. Show you the difference in the lines. This would be a mistake from black, because now knight d5. But on queen x d4, there's no defense of the bishop on b2, so if the knight were to hop into d5, the queen can just take on b2. So when bishop takes, just white's forced to play this ugly move. And white still has some play because he has this bishop pair. And after something like king h1, the rook can come to the g file, which is sort of making the best of a bad situation. But this decimated pawn structure really favors black. This is a very favorable position for black. So rook ad1 is sort of forced here. And black can breathe very easy now that this light square bishop has been taken off the board. You know, white still has some chances here. Mostly tied into the d4-d5 break, because without that light square bishop, it's just hard for white to generate any sort of decisive attack against the black king side. That light square bishop is what does a lot of the heavy lifting in these attacking positions. So white still has some chances here, but black can breathe very, very easy here. So rook e8 is just a little bit too routine and too passive. When you're playing against the hanging pawns, harassing the light square bishop is something that you need to strongly consider, because once that piece gets off the board, you tend to breathe a lot easier. So rook e8, just a little bit too passive. Rook fd1, so again, looking to prepare d5, this helps defend the pawn on d4, sort of by x-ray. So excellent move. Rook c8, this is just, again, too routine. Bishop f8, this is a routine defensive move in these sorts of positions, this reorganization. Staring at the queen on a2, and that sort of enforces a defense against d5 immediately. 97, and 97 reroutes the knight for defense. It can hop to f5 to block out the bishop on b1. Most likely it'll hop to g6, where it provides excellent defense to the black king side. This looks tensely balanced. Rook c8, just a little bit too routine. Rook ac1, this is also routine. d5 works here immediately. Again, when you're playing with the hanging pawns, this is the move you really want to be on the lookout for, more or less constantly. Always look to your pawn breaks. Again, a pawn break is where you bring one of your pawns in contact with an opponent's pawn, where you can trade those pawns off. It's really the engine for the dynamism for a lot of positions, where that pawn trade opens up lines, it opens up diagonals for your pieces. In the hanging pawn structure, this d4-d5 push, or for black, d5-d4. But that d-pawn break is really what drives a lot of the activity for the position. And here it's quite nice. Knight d4. And even in the endgame here, this bishop pair, now that it's completely unleashed, is quite strong. Rook d8. Notice that this is losing. You can do the knight fork, or if the rook tries to fight for the d-file, black just gets mated. But if black just plays solidly here, check this analysis out in the game notes, but this is the best that black can do. But this bishop pair, bishops on b2 and d3, they're incredibly strong. This is a quite nice position for whites. And again, that's sort of part and parcel of the move d5. Opening up the position when you have that sort of bishop pair perfectly organized behind them. That's exactly what you want to be looking to do. So rook ac1 is not bad. The rook is nice on c1, but you should be looking to play a lot more aggressively with these hanging pawns, ripping open the position and activating your activity. Queen d6, again, this is just too routine. Knight b4, white really needs to be harassing that light square bishop. 95, again, on bishop b1, this is the trade you'll be looking to do a lot to try to weaken white's position. Here, it's targeting the c-pawn instead. If the queen takes, then just rook x c4. So if white takes with the f-pawn, again, this is a horrendous pawn structure for white. The bishop pair compensates for it somewhat, but not enough in my opinion. This is a really ugly pawn structure to deal with as white. So 95 probably has to be played. 7. And again, without the light squared bishop, black breathes so much easier in these sorts of positions. You know, black has the bishop pair as an asset for himself, first of all, but that light squared bishop is really what causes a lot of the attacking mischief when you're defending against hanging pawns. Without that light squared bishop, black can breathe a lot easier in these positions. So queen d6, again, just too routine. It just allows white to build at leisure. Bishop e1, again, this is too routine. d5 is working already. Again, this is the move you always want to be on the lookout for when you have hanging pawns. And here, it's perfectly prepared. All of white's pieces are just optimally placed for this. E takes is the critical line. I give another note in the game notes so you can look at. Knight b5. And this is a good example of how the d-pawn can just be a strength unto itself. So, obviously the queen can't take because of discovery and winning the black queen. So, queen is forced back. c4. And this pawn on d5 is just a big strength to itself right now. It's just cutting the board in half. It's threatening to simply advance. Notice that the knight can't take. And white's simply up a piece, and the tactics are working here. So bishop e1, again, it's a routine move. It's not necessarily bad, but white can do much better. This d-pawn break is already working. That's the break you always want to be looking for in these structures. Queen f4, this is just, again, allowing white another shot at it. Bishop f8, it solidifies the position. It discourages d5 with this x-ray. One potential line. Bishop g7. Look at this reorganization for black, because this is quite important in a lot of positions. g6, it blunts off this important attacking b1 to h7 diagonal. And this maneuver of bishop e7, bishop f8, and then bishop g7 is very important in a lot of these positions. This re-fee and shadowing of the dark square bishop is quite thematic. It's targeting the d-pawn, which activates some of black's counterplay. But this playing g6 is quite often vital in these positions to blunt out white's importance in attacking light square bishop. So highlight that. That's an important maneuver for your database, being able to play bishop f8, g6, bishop g7. It's a quite common reorganization. White can also take on e4 with the bishop. This is just another line that I give. And this is a balanced position. F5 is a pawn weakness. It creates a weakness on e5 to deal with, but white still has his weaknesses. And again, now that the light square bishops are off, black can breathe a little bit easier. Queen f4 just allows all the usual stuff. And finally, d5 gets played on the board. And this is always the move you want to be building towards with hanging pawns. cx-d5, wrong move order. cx-d5, and black has to find this crazy move, which, over the board, you're not going to find that. Knight b4 is a normal move, but that just gets crushed. Knight d4 is just an absurd, incredible move. Black is down a full piece, but he's getting his material back. The point is, after queen h5, g6, this white queen is suddenly trapped. So black's queen goes kamikaze. d4. Black has to take a timeout. Of course, if black takes on b1, that's a checkmate. And this is the best that white can do. White's up a pawn here. Black does have some compensation. His rook on e1 is quite active. But white's up a pawn. The only person that can win this position is white. But this is an absurd move, this knight d4. Literally every other move just gets crushed, and that's the power of the d4-d5 break. So often, d4-d5, when played successfully, leads to positions like these, where white's just bulldozing through. The fact that knight d4 works is almost just like a tactical accident of the position. So, check out the analysis in the game notes. It's not thematic to learning about these hanging pawn structures. The fact that knight d4 works is just sort of almost a silly accident. But cx-d5 is the wrong move order. Knight b8, this is just too passive. And that's that's been the story for black's play in this position. You never want to be passive when you're defending. You want to be looking for active counter chances. Here, knight b4 is simply better. Targeting the d-pawn, keeping this knight in the game. One potential line I give b8. And it's different from the previous notes in that black still has active play here. He's staying organized against the d-pawn and forcing white to keep a defensive hat on. He's not just allowing white to play Von Bonk against this position. c5. And black, in this line, even manages to win the d-pawn. And white still has some compensation. But this is black's game to win, just being up that pawn. Knight b8 is just way too passive. You don't defend passively. Always look for counter chances where you can. So rook d4, getting that tempo against the black queen and activating this rook. And this is another excellent example of a position where the d-pawn is a strength in itself. Even if white never really achieves a kingside attack, white can simply just shoo this queen away from the blockade and just start jamming the pawn up the board. This pawn on d5 is incredibly strong. It is certainly not a weak isolated pawn. Bishop f8, again, too passive. Knight bd7 at least redeploys this knight. Maybe get to c5. Bishop f8, just a little bit passive. So this trades some material off the board, but now look at these bishops on b2 and b1, this queen on a4. Again, this is exactly what d4-d5 achieves, breaking up the position for basically all of white's pieces. But here, this bishop pair specifically are just deployed perfectly to attack the black king side. And look at the knight on b8, the bishop on b7, the rook on c8. None of them are anywhere close to the black king side to defend. Queen h6, black plays u6, just shift to the next diagonal, 6. And white's just going to continue detonating the position open. This is a decisive attack for white. Knight g5, just increasing the pressure. h4, just nudging that up the board to stop any cheap mate threats. Knight d7, and then just decimating black's pawn structure. Knight xf7, this is a cute little finalizing tactic. If the black king takes, just queen d7, winning one of those bishops. So queen c1, cute little, the bishop controls h2, so white cannot take that, because that would be a checkmate. But white has better than this. Knight xd6, this is a pretty piece of analysis from Keres. He's completely confident that his king is safe. So, the fact that the queen can't come to f4 here is what makes all this work. g3, h5, and Taimanov finally resigned here. White's simply up a piece. The real meat and potatoes of the position, of course, much earlier. So this is as close to a perfectly balanced hanging pawns as you can pretty much get. We basically start from equal ground here. Really, the downfall of black in this position is he just never played actively against the hanging pawns. So after queen e2, this is a mistake. Black is just never... You want to be harassing white's position and preventing him from building up. With the hanging pawns, you want to build up your pieces and work towards that d4-d5 pawn break. When you're defending against the hanging pawns, you want to either be restraining that d-pawn break or harassing white's position to the point where he's never able to build up for that d-pawn break. So black had several chances to play knight b4, which harasses this key light squared bishop. And he just never took it. These are just routine moves from black. Bishop 1, again, white didn't play ideally himself, but in some ways his play was still more logical than black, because black just never developed any sort of counterplay against either these hanging pawns or any of white's key pieces. And by the time this came in the game, it was just too late, even with the tactical accidents of knight b8. Again, the theme for black is just way too passive the entire game. And you can't play passively really in any position, but especially against hanging pawns. You need to be playing dynamically, grabbing your own counter chances. Black just played so passively. Look at this bishop on b7, the knight on b8, the rook on c8. By the time the things get opened up and white finally aims at the black king side, all of these pieces are completely irrelevant to the main battle. At any point, black had several chances during the game to actually harass white's position. And missing knight b4 here especially was the key chance to sort of eliminate white's attacking firepower. When you're defending against hanging pawns, if you can eliminate one of the bishops, especially the key light square bishop, you can breach so much easier. But the story for white in this game, he just built up maybe a little bit too routinely, but by the time he finally achieves that key d4-d5 pawn break, that's really the key to the position. That opens up things incredibly profitably for white. So, classic game from Keres. We're going to shift gears with our next lesson. We're going to be looking at pushing the d-pawn as sort of a strength for the endgame, whereas the d-pawn is sort of a pass pawn that we're looking to promote at some point, rather than as an attacking mechanism against the king's side. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.